Giants of the Old World. Now, if war is a cover story, we have to figure out what they, the controllers, were covering up. As we move forward and understand that we have to rethink what we were told and restudy the past historical record, we also need to see and understand what has been covered up and forgotten. What came before us, and who were the people of the old world? Why were they hidden? Now we start to think about and hypothesize the idea of a lost civilization that used to exist. We are told it may have existed thousands of years ago, not only a few hundred years ago. Another thing that is off limits to talk about or hypothesize is the idea of giants or giant people. But the more you look into the old world and find evidence of giant people, items, maps, and civilizations with giants, along with giant bones, and on and on and on, the more you look, the more you find. So you look at all these older pictures, and this is kind of the only way we have to verify our historical record are from these pictures, paintings, and things like that. And you see all these people who still, even if they are of giant proportion, according to our size, these buildings were still built by a much larger people because of how small they are when you look at the size of the buildings and you look at the size of the people. And another thing that you can see is in the background, there's pyramids in the back, and there's always pyramids all throughout our realm and throughout Tartaria. There's pyramids in China, there's pyramids in the Middle East, there's pyramids in the South, there's pyramids in Russia, there's pyramids everywhere, Mexico, South America, and they really only want to acknowledge the pyramids in Egypt and possibly the pyramids in Mexico or in South America. So it's very interesting the amount of evidence that suggests that these pyramids are everywhere and they're covered up, and maybe the mud flood concealed them, but they're still all there waiting to be excavated. So you look at all of this architecture, the size of this architecture, and people will say this is just a drawing or a painting. But when you start to really put all the clues together, put all the pieces together, it doesn't make sense that this would have just been paintings to show off how great they can paint giant buildings and stuff. And you also take into account to how much was destroyed before civilization really got on track, so there wouldn't really be any historical record of these giant buildings or giant people. But as we go forward, you're going to see there's lots and lots of evidence. So, more evidence of the worldwide flooding events with the buildings protruding out of the water and the survivors scurrying. So, this must have happened very quickly. Some massive event takes place, all of the world is flooded, and then it slowly drains off where civilization gets back on track. And we see this kind of over and over again, the themes of flooding. All the ancient cultures talk about the great flood that came, cleared the land, cleaned the land off, and then made way for the next civilization to be built or constructed on top of it. Very fascinating that you keep seeing the Greco-Roman architecture, you see the flooding, you see the survivors over and over and over again. Now, realm-wide flooding followed by a period of time of settling, then repopulation with new stories put into place, history rewritten, the truth hidden, and who were these people who came before this massive flooding event, this reset event, and the time before that we're calling the Old World and Tartary and the Tartarian Empire and things like that. So you start to look at the landmarks that did not get destroyed. And as you're looking at these giant monolithic sized superstructures that don't seem to serve any purpose other than they say it's a welcoming to the city or something. And these giant gateways are everywhere. makes me think that most likely this is a piece of technology that was either bricked over or concealed, but it's very odd how many of these giant gateways still exist today. And one other thing to look at when you're looking at these giant gateways, look in the background over here where this arrow is pointing. Look at the scaffolding. They're doing some repairing or painting over here, and it's just the scaffolding is just barely hanging on, thrown together, and it's just the same people who would have built this super gateway structure, how who knows when it was actually constructed, are the same people putting up these horrible scaffoldings and making repairs to these buildings that were already there at the time. So here's another one of these giant gateways, and this is some of the most compelling evidence we have when you look at the size of the people and you look at the size of the structure. Now, I theorize that possibly these structures may have been some kind of a crypt or something. And at the very top, you see the difference between the picture that we just went over. It doesn't have the top piece on there, where this piece does have a giant top piece. So I theorize that possibly there is the body or the corpse of like a giant in that tomb or whatever, possibly. So that's just something I was kind of thinking, and it would make sense of hiding all this right out in plain sight, the corpse and bones of a giant person who would have been 50, 60 feet tall or something in this casket on top of this structure. It's a possibility, but it's just something I was kind of thinking about. It looks kind of like a coffin sitting up on top of that thing. So here's a painting of this old world gateway structure. It's the exact same structure we see, and it's a painting from who knows how long ago it was. And you see the growth of the trees, you see the growth on top of the structure, you see the Colosseum in the background that's destroyed, making people understand these structures may have been in place hundreds of years before these people arrived. And when you look at the size of the people in this old painting, and you put that against the size of the people we see today at the exact same structure, they are far smaller in proportion than the people in the paintings. And the historians will just tell you, well, the painter just got confused and didn't get the proportions right, and you look how detailed the painting is. Another thing that you could look for is at the top, the people at the top are proportioned to the people at the bottom. So that's very interesting how you can see this all kind of playing out, where you see the inhabitants of this old world, these people with the blue arrows, and then you see these people at the top where it's very similar to the people who you see up at the top of this superstructure here, if you can kind of see where these arrows are pointing to. So I think that is a big clue to kind of what is going on with this big reset and how they're really trying to cover up the narrative of giants and things like that. So we relook at all of these old paintings, and we have to now assume that these people would have been the giant people who are, maybe they're the ones who reclaimed all of this civilization from an even gianter group of people. And you understand that if this mud flood came through and buried everything under 20 or 30 feet of mud, what might be down at the ground level where all these structures start from. I mean, that's where all these giant bones would be discovered. And it's really interesting that a lot of people don't want to. Everything associated with this old world and Tartary and this research and flat earth, any of the general public kind of NPC people do not want to accept any of this. They don't want to look at any of this information. They really are apart, set themselves apart from this type of research. And this is how we know that they're the ones who are associated with Freemasonry. They're the ones who are making money off of this grift, if you will. If they're a part of academia, if they're the teachers and the professors and all this stuff, they have based their lives and careers off of the narratives given to them by these controllers, which are all a fabrication. And when we want to know the truth, we do all this research for free because we want to know the truth. And this is a massive piece of the puzzle that keeps sticking out of the mud, if you will, where we cannot take their word for it any longer. We have to discount all of their ideas and all of their theories because their theories are not backed by any sort of evidence other than just what they were told by these controller people. Okay, moving on, we see these giant superstructures, and you see these little teeny people who most likely were giant compared to us. But our people don't seem to be shown in these older people because we might have been a creation after the fact. Okay, and you see this giant superstructure on top of this platform, and the people are very small. Now, is this some type of a structure that is like a flying city? They've got some kind of anti-gravity in giant uh this giant superstructure here. And you can see this as when you go back into our historical record and you understand there were accounts of these giant flying cities and things like that, you have to think, was this part of this old world theory that a lot of these cities would have been mounted on these giant platforms? They would have known these super floods would have come, and they could have just levitated their city and flown it to outside of the realm, another place, higher ground, something like that. It's very interesting. And the more you kind of start looking into this and try to either prove these theories wrong, prove my theories wrong, or prove that these controller people who run our realm, they're telling the truth, the more evidence you look, the more evidence that you find. So you look at all of these historical paintings, and all of the people seem to be the same size. And this is why they would have destroyed a lot of these superstructures, because all the paintings would lead you to believe that these are not the same people according to our height and our perspective. And the kind of further back, the more etchings and pictures you find, and it's just the buildings and stuff get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is where you get into the idea of super technology or even biblical interference, godly interference to wipe these buildings out, melt these buildings, destroy these buildings, hide these buildings, conceal these buildings, all of these things that are kind of going on that we're just uncovering now. We also have to assume how much evidence has been hidden and how much is still available. That if we can somehow reclaim our past and correct the historical timeline within the depths of the Vatican or something, they would have all this evidence that would support the idea of all this stuff. And we also know things like the Library of Alexandria burning down in, I think it was like 240 AD or something. It was, and that's what contained a majority of all of this information, which has now been lost to time. Then you get into the book burning of the Nazis, and it's all part of the same narrative of destroying the history and rewriting it. Now, people will say that the Nazis were burning gender books and things like that, but no one had ever heard of anything associated with gender books until about a year or 2 years ago. And now they all say, well, Hitler was trying to stop the gender books. But most likely they were destroying all of the evidence and burning up all these evidence and hiding and concealing all this evidence. They would go around and, you know, art taking art and pictures and paintings and all this stuff that would depict a lot of this old world, the citizens and the people who came before that. And that was one of the hugest, wide spanning operations of World War I, World War II. The Civil War was recapturing all of the evidence they needed to make sure their theories would hold and that their narratives would be sufficient enough to brainwash and trick future generations. And we see a lot of commonality with a lot of this kind of research where people will say it's a lithograph and a drawing, and then you'll find real evidence that supports that there are buildings up on top of these platforms and stuff, and how many of these have been destroyed, and how many, giant building structures were destroyed. This mud flood covered them, and now they just say, well, that was a mountain or something, and people are historical evidence is finding all of these caves with Egyptian artifacts in them. If you know about the Grand Canyon and, what were they really doing trying to get into these gold mines and recovering lost technology and, it's a rabbit hole. All of this research is a rabbit hole, and it will all take you down a different pathway. But it seems like it doesn't matter which pathway you go down, they all kind of lead to the same spot. So it's very interesting. You can see the giant, you know, super city on top of this platform, and you see evidence that they were building civilizations and buildings and stuff on these platforms. And it all connects to the airships and things like that. It's very, it's old world, but it's kind of like a Star Wars kind of idea, how advanced things were and how much they've hidden the flying machines of the old world. Going back to my Scenario Aero Club video, if you start looking and going down that rabbit hole, it will really connect more and more dots that it's pieces of evidence that they want you to overlook and move on, but there's so many of them. You really gotta, start making a list and understanding that everything we were told is a lie. And we have to ask ourselves what really happened. So I see all these old pictures, I see all this old world buildings, I see mud flood buildings everywhere, and you see all of these people, which were probably 17-foot tall people with lots of evidence to support this. But whenever I'm starting to look at all these old pictures in museums and paintings and stuff, I always now ask myself, what size are these people? Because it seems like when civilization gets back on track, and the we start going through the cloning ideas of the civilization was cloned and reset, the people who were cloned are not the people who built any of these buildings because they're just not proportioned to those people. And we look at the difference in the height, and you see these giant people, which they will say no possible way were these giants around. But we look and we find more and more and more evidence of a concealment, of a conspiracy, of a cover up, hiding these people, which would explain and kind of prove more of the biblical ideas of in Genesis 6:4 it says there were giants in the earth, and after that, when the sons of man interbred with the daughters of you know it's in there. It talks about giants all the time. So then we do more research, we look at the kind of older superstructures, and they want to claim they're bell towers or something, but I think there's something much more going on. And you can also see the other major part of this is the idea of these super airships that would have been a major part of the all of this operation that you see is these airships throughout. And this would have been a type of anti-gravity. I mean, I really do cover a lot of this in my Scenario Aero Club video, but a lot of the older pictures you find, the skies are all whited out because these airships were everywhere. And it's a very interesting key to understanding how they would have built things in the middle of nowhere, these superstructures, if you can deliver all the supplies by these super airships and stuff. So moving on, we're getting into, you look at all these old pictures, you look at the size and the scale, and how big the bricks were according to these people. Now you look into this antediluvians of the inhabitants of our realm during the days of Noah. And these would have been, I don't know, 70-foot tall giants, 100-foot tall giants. I mean, these would have been really large humans uh, to our size. And these most likely are the people who would have built the super old world, the Greco Roman kind of structures. And then this biblical flood happens. All of humanity is wiped out except for Noah and his family line. Where then, after the flood water dissipates, they land and you can see civilization getting back over. Then you see a gradual reduction in the size of the occupants of this realm. We're down at the bottom. You see where that green arrow is. I'm going to go up where you can't see it and you can see it. This is where we are. We're the green arrow. We are the Lilliputians, the little teeny recreations of something that came before. And then you look at the next arrow and you see these other giants next to the green arrow here. So you see the green arrow is us, the yellow area, those would have been the inhabitants of this old world. So the further back you go, the bigger things get, the bigger people get, the bigger the superstructures and the buildings all get. So when we're looking at these old paintings, and you can see the types of ornamentation and the statues of the people and all this stuff, it really, you try to figure out where they go on this antediluvian map of the days of Noah and how all of this kind of connects to the further back you go, the older the paintings, the larger the people get, the scale of things gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the kind of style, the artwork, the beauty of the paintings and the architecture and the clothing and all this stuff, kind of, the further back you go, the nicer it is, to where now we're living in this after time where Satan is in control and it's just everything is garbage and trash. So here you can see, remember back to our picture of the giants standing next with the arrows. Okay, so I look at this and I have found a picture from this old world of these giants flat, frozen solid from, I think this is from Siberia, Russia somewhere, but you can clearly see the difference in height of these people. You can see the green arrow is us way down at the bottom, and you see the next group of people, which were these old world people, in scale to these other people. And it's really, I mean, I don't know how you can disagree with it when we actually have photographs of these people. And we know there's way more photographs that have been hidden. So it's kind of, you see the scale of the people, you see the scale of the giants, you see the depiction on uh the biblical map after the days of Noah. You see the height difference here in the paintings and within the photograph that we have found. So then you get into these giant Tartarians and the mini Phoenicians. And this is another rabbit hole you can go down, looking into these giant Tartarian people, looking into these mini Phoenicians. And a really good movie to watch is the Gulliver's Travel movie with Ted Danson. And that is really will help the perception of your mind kind of lock all this in to where you can see it. And within this Gulliver's Travel book that was written in 1780 or 90 or something, they have depictions of flying cities, they have the depictions of giants, and the giants go all the way up to Titan sized super giants, which we don't know what really could be on the other side of these ice walls. We don't know what existed before the biblical flood in the Bible that wiped out all of these people during the days of Noah and the Noah's Ark flood and things like that. So, highly recommend watching the Gulliver's Travel movie. It's great. It was a mini series, so it's like 3 hours long, but I think it came in three parts or something. But it's really fascinating to watch and understand how all this kind of fits in. And we also assume that the more pictures we find, because a lot of this history has been hidden and concealed, and the essence of the time would have been they're deleting all this evidence, they're blurring out these cities, they're hiding all evidence of these giants. And there would have been maybe pockets of this historical information that would have survived. And this is why we see so much of the artificial intelligence or the AI trying to create a number of false pictures and false historical evidence to kind of muddy the waters of our research. But we know it won't work because even if they delete thousands and create thousands of fake pictures, we have the hard evidence of what was concealed and hidden. And we'll get to that in just a minute. So these are skeletal figures represented just a few giants that have been unearthed and documented within our historical records, along with the historical accounts of King Bashan, who whose bed was 13 and a half feet long. And you just start, the further back you go, the larger and larger and larger these giants get. And we also have hard evidence that says that, as this expansion of our territory and the expansion of the reset humanity goes out, they're constantly we're finding giant bones, giant skulls, giant tools, all this giant stuff, where then the Smithsonian would come in and take all the evidence of it for scientific research, and then it would all just be destroyed. And they admit to destroying thousands of human skeletons. You can look it up for yourself. Smithsonian destroys giant skeletons and things like that. And you're not supposed to question anything. You're just supposed to accept that giants go against the historical narrative and they will never be shown or seen by anyone. And this is just a massive part of this historical um, falsity that we have been part of. And we know the Smithsonian hides all this, but we also know every city and town which has these brick buildings hides the evidence of this. They hide the mud flood. They hide all of this evidence, which all goes together, and no one's allowed to really say anything about it within the mainstream narrative. You're never allowed to bring up giant bones, and if you do, they will just completely look at you like bring up flat earth to a boomer or something. They go all out, and the programming does not set well with them, and they will, throw a fit so they don't have to listen to any of these arguments. And that's also a big key because these were the boomer generation was the first generation fully programmed by the television, by the radio frequency weapons. And that is the hardest programming to overcome. So the more you kind of look into this, the more you find tons of giant skulls, tons of giant evidence, and, throughout not America, but if you go to South America and some, you'll see lots more evidence of this. That within the third world, they're a lot less likely to adhere to the orders of the controllers. And the more people look, the more people find, and it just kind of it's ready for everything to stop and be reset because the game's pretty much over. future generations will see this work, and there'll be more evidence that is found, which it's at this point, I think it's undeniable when you put all this together. But getting people to see it and accept it is different than the people who are already awake and aware looking into it. And the more you look, the more you find. There is tons of evidence of these giant footprints. I mean, this footprint in this valley is I don't know how big this is. 1,000 foot footprint. I mean, it's pretty big on Google Earth. So a lot of this, bigger these people get, the more it discounts the idea of globe Earth. We can't be on a globe if these giant people were once walking around. And you get into giant creatures, the giant evidence of giant dead creatures, the mud fossil aspect to all this, which we'll get into later. But very interesting. Very interesting. The amount of evidence, the footprints that are in granite, the giant fossilized mummies that they find. And, within the Bible, it says these Nephilim were these giants and they had 6 toes and 6 fingers and things like that. And, you look on these old lithographs. Now, I think this was in one of these pyramids or something, but you can see the date palm trees. You can see the size of the people that are right up where the date palms are, and you see how small humans are in perspective to them. So, you start looking more and more, you'll find more and more, and then it's up to you if you want to accept the version that they're telling you or the version of new information that we have uncovered. And there's tons of all these statues. You see all these statues here. They would have been proportioned to the giant people. And we can put you can look back and look at all the pictures we put in size and the difference. And it's all very much, I think it's 100% proven, but, the mainstream narrative will never accept this. So here you can see clearly a depiction of these giants of this old world. You see the next size down giants, and then you see us down here at bottom. And I mean, it's just who knows how advanced these giants were. When you start to understand that, how much has been hidden, how much has been concealed from us, concealed from our historical record, concealed from our past. And, I think it's just a matter of time before we all sit down and say no more. And I mean, no more of this deception. We're living in the truth. We're standing on fact and foundation, and we need this evidence to come out. We need our historical record to be corrected where when the historical record is corrected, that's when it stops repeating and we can get out of this cycle and return to what we're supposed to do, living the way we're supposed to live. So, lots of historical, I want to say myths, mythology, all talk about giants and how the giants had to be eradicated and exterminated because they were like cannibals and they would have just raided a village, ate people, and they would just I mean, you could just pick up a person and just start eating them. I mean, these are giant, rabid, cannibal monster kind of people. And lots of historical accounts of giants, seeing giants, bones of giants, all this kind of, look into it, do your own research, and it will be proven very easily how big these people were. And, the kind of older you go back, the more they would have existed. And this is kind of another reason why they killed off all of the buffalo and all this stuff was to starve out the native population because the native population were these giant people that they had to get rid of. So, very interesting stuff. Now, next, I want to talk about this Cardiff giant. Now, this was a fossilized giant person that was dug out of a field. And if you've been following my research for a while, I've been covering this for a long time, and it connects to the next major aspect of this research, which is the mud fossils and the mud fossilization of biology turning into geology. So, a farmer was farming his field and he hits this rock and starts to try to dig this rock out. And as he starts digging this rock out, he finds out that this is a giant fossilized corpse of this giant right under the top of the mud. So, not millions of years, not thousands of years. This would have been during this mud flood event. A lot of these giants would have been buried in the dirt, drowned possibly. And when you start to talk about drowning in salt water, that's how a lot of this fossilization occurs due to the exchange of minerals and elements and things like that through the transition metals of blood using salt as a conductor. And it's a very interesting piece of this puzzle. So, they dig up this giant fossilized person. Then the Smithsonian comes out and figures out they can't move it or transport it, it's too heavy, and they just say it was a hoax. You know, some farmer who's, you know, out tilling his field has the extra money and resources to create a 17-foot tall paper mache creature out of cement, bury it in his field, then he digs it up and says, "Look what I found." It's just more of their bullshit narrative that would have passed off. But now that we can accumulate this research and we set it all together, it really shows that something else is going on here. So they dug up this giant person, this Cardiff giant, and it's clearly all of the original people knew it was a giant fossilized people. And there's lots of stories of moving graves, and when they go to dig up the person to move their grave, they've been turned to stone. Now, I remember a story. I looked for it more, I couldn't find it. But Wild Bill Hickok in Deadwood was killed and was buried somewhere. Later, they then dug him up to transport the body to a better resting site. And as they dug up, Wild Bill Hickok, his body had fully turned to stone and had fossilized within only a very small amount of time. Now, you can look that up for yourself, but it is 100% true. And this goes to show you that when you bury someone without, extracting their organs and embalming them and then putting them in a wood box and sealing it and making sure that there's no pressure leaks or anything, if you just bury them in the dirt, this kind of mud fossilization process takes place. The elements are exchanged, and this fossilization occurs. And then, if you can go down another rabbit hole of the mud fossils and all of the vast amount of research that's been accumulated in conjunction to the giant people and how geology is basically fossilized biology. And it really, when you step back and examine the scale, I mean, we're like the size of bacteria contained within this little petri dish of our world, where more and more massive Titan sized creatures would have existed. So, very fascinating. They the original Cardiff giant was taken away by the Smithsonian or something. They then created a replica of it, which was on display. But it's a very interesting thing that you can go down and look at, research, find all these pictures. And it's very, very, it's a piece of the puzzle that they want to act like it doesn't exist, but it's very real and you can look into it for yourself. And there you see the scale again, going back to this photo of this Cardiff giant. You can see how big the giants are. You can see how big the people are. You can see the scale here in this photograph. So, very interesting stuff. Now, you can also see this is Cain and Abel. The Canaanites were said to be of gigantic proportion. These Nephilim with the 6 fingers and 6 toes. And these are depicted widely in a biblical sense. But then You start getting into modern day science and history, and they do not account or accept any version that there was ever any giants ever existing ever. And this also kind of goes to the idea of Bigfoot. They want to have this plausible deniability that there is a giant, monkey ape creature out in the middle of the woods hiding around. I heard through the grapevine that a lot of these giant footprints most likely could be connected to the giants that live in the underground realm or something. And it's like when we're doing these conspiracy theories, it doesn't make a lot of sense to limit yourself when you're theorizing things. Okay, when you're theorizing or hypothesizing, you need the most amount of evidence you can find. And from that, you can make the greatest theory that you can have for explaining all these things. Okay, now here goes back to the days after Noah and the fallen angels and all this kind of stuff. It all kind of goes all together. And the only thing we don't know is the actual dates and times of these things because of this reset of our history, the pushing back our historical timeline, the creating of the dinosaur narrative, which pushes our timeline back millions of years and things like that. And you can all just kind of see how this deception gets going after this 1850 time period where they want people to be working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, working until you die. You never can get ahead. You never can do anything other than work, work, work. And it's just, this is how they robbed us of our divine place in this realm by hiding this truth, which is so becoming so widely known. So, very interesting. And here's a quote, Numbers 13, 3 and 3. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. So we were in their sight. Right? Does that make sense? I guess. But yeah, when you start looking at 36-foot tall people, these super giants that would have existed, it makes a lot of sense that, these super giants would have been the ones building and doing a lot of this work because to scale, it would have taken them a lot less time than it would have taken us, these small little grasshopper people. Very interesting. Now, next, I want to talk about another conspiracy theory that's been going around, and that is of this Kandahar giant. Now, this Kandahar giant also has connections to these old world inhabitants and of these Nephilim creatures who have red hair, 6 fingers, 6 toes, 2 rows of teeth, and are of this giant old world size perspective, I guess you could say, of 17 to 20 foot tall. Now, in Afghanistan, a squad of people on patrol, soldiers and American soldiers were on patrol, and one squad went missing. So another squad was sent out to locate them. And as they come around this corner, they see all this military gear, weapons, all the stuff destroyed, blood everywhere. And they also would smell something really gross or something out of this area. It was at towards the entrance of a cave. And out of this cave, this giant red-haired cannibalistic monster guy comes out of this cave and starts engaging in these Marines, where then the Marines open fire and supposedly kill this giant. And this is like a well documented thing within the conspiracy circles, although there is no physical proof because this is the top secret kind of stuff they would cover up just like they would cover up a UFO crash or something. It is super highly top secret, the understanding and concealment of these giants, because it connects so much to this old world. And if you've seen my video on the demonic entities, extraterrestrials, or demonic entities, aliens, and extraterrestrials, we get into this idea of these Nephilim or these Anunnaki giants who came to Earth, and they all had white skin and red hair. And it also goes into the idea of demonic entities, these clown entities with white skin and red hair. And it's all kind of everything kind of explains itself a little bit more when you find and add these pieces of the puzzle of these giant red-haired, white-skinned, humanoids who live underground and are cannibals and things like that. Another very interesting piece of the puzzle that we could not skip over. We had to add this little piece in. So, the idea of giants, the skeletal remains of giants, the footprints of giants, the the more remote you find larger and larger footprints, and you also can look into the size of the doors, the scale of the buildings, how small people are in proportion to these giant doors, and they'll just give you some stupid explanation of they had to build these doors so big so they could move furniture in. And it's just like the most lazy theory ever. And these are all pieces of the puzzle that show that they are lying, and they've always been lying. Is the size of the building materials, the further back you go when they're talking about millions of year old walls and stuff, all constructed with these thousands and thousands of pound bricks, monolithic structures, all created by this builder race of these giants. And then you get into physical evidence of, here are these swords, there are giant books that they always find. And this is a lot of what they would have been burning and hiding and concealing, are all of these books and manuscripts, because these were people who, if you're making paper and you have high level steel production and stuff, it just goes to explain more and more that these people were so highly advanced, and we basically came along after and basically, wrote on the back of their civilization, figured out all their inventions, figured out all of their chemical recipes and their alchemy and stuff like that, and, stole all of their old world information, found all these books, reclaimed them, found all their secrets, found where certain historical sites would have been, and if they had to be covered up, they would be. If they had to be controlled, they could build a military base, and now nobody can get in to see what kind of caves there are. There's lots of examples in Germany and stuff of them making bombing ranges and test sites on these old world sites. So they'd make sure to really hide all evidence through bombings, through, whatever they had to do to conceal these things. And the more, you know, under the sea, there's tons of historical information and artifacts and stuff under the ocean. Here you can see a giant helmet. It's like a Spartan kind of helmet found under the sea by divers. And we have to assume, what else have they found that they're not allowed to show us? I mean, is there giant megalithic buildings under the ocean they've found? We don't know, but I would assume that the more we start looking, the more we're going to find more and more evidence, until the point where they have to acknowledge these discoveries. Now, here's a crown, and look how small these people are compared to this crown. This would have been the Noah sized people's crown, how big this stuff is. And it's all like concealed in the Vatican and concealed in these underground bunkers and cities and all this stuff underground. It's just, when resources were so scarce, these small people are just going to build a crown that fits 100-foot tall guy or something. I mean, it's just, none of this really makes a lot of sense, and that's a big piece of this puzzle. And I would also assume that, like, the people of the George Washington era would have been giant people, and all of this stuff, kind of, it's their history that we stole and said that this is our history to explain the timeline, explain the buildings, and explain all this stuff. So, wrapping it up, did giants exist? Yes, I believe they did exist. I believe these giants were the ones responsible for a lot of the creation of the old world, creation of these old buildings, creation of these giant super, you know, hubs of underground trains. And, it's like, how big are things? How big is the underground? We know there's a big fascination with the underground bases and things like that. And it just, are they building these underground bases, or are they reclaiming something that's already there? And I think they are reclaiming stuff that's already there. Now, here is a piece of physical evidence that has been found. Now, this was found in some shop, pawn shop, something in China in like the early 1900s. Now, this is a finger. This is just the finger of one of these supergiants from the days of Noah. And you can see by that green arrow there, that's the fingernail. And how big was a person? Now, if you ask history about this, they'll say that this one person had a rare genetic disease that just caused their index finger to grow 4 foot long or something. It's so lazy. But, we have all this other evidence of the giants, which then proves they're kind of lying about all this stuff. So there you can see that's my finger, and you can see the finger. Where did this go? Oh, the Smithsonian came in to do evidence and research, and then it goes into the depths of the Smithsonian, never seen again, never talked about again, covered up and hidden from the people. So, I mean, there's so much evidence, and the more people look into and try to find this evidence, looking through their own family's historical records and things like that, looking through some of these abandoned, super old world structures, they find more and more evidence of this. So they're hiding the giant bones. They're hiding the accuracy of biblical accounts. They're resetting the historical record, the technology, and the population. They're brainwashing and controlling the New World people. And once you see it, and understand these things at the foundational level, the spells are broken. But we have to see these things for what they are and not what they tell us they are. Now, another thing is we should also rethink the narrative of dinosaurs. Finding all these giant bones, which are most likely like human femur bones and hip bones and things like that, they find all these giant bones right under the topsoil, not down below the depths of the buried buildings. Okay, if you understand the mud flood buildings, 20 feet of mud covering the entire world, and these super giant bones are just right under the top of the dirt, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Common sense explains a lot of this stuff, but common sense, the science and all the history will tell you, don't look into the common sense aspect of this. Follow our history and science. We've got 10,000 anthropologists and geologists that are looking in these dinosaur bones and all this stuff. It's just part of their deception, and we're calling it out as we see it. So the term dinosaur was coined in 1842 by an anatomist, Richard Owens, when he grouped several prehistoric reptiles under the name of Dinosauria, which means terrible lizard. And the million-year-old bones cannot be at a shallower depth than the buildings. It's the most common sense thing, but the historians will tell you that is no mud flood buildings. There is none of this stuff that we claim, because if they acknowledged it, their narrative goes away and their control paradigm goes away. So people kept finding giant bones and skulls, so the narrative of dinosaur was created. And we see that over and over again. Now, I also have to mention how the controllers want us to believe in dinosaurs, but not dragons. Even though there is far more evidence to support the claim that dragons were real and that dinosaurs are fake. And the reason for this is to push the timeline back and create the idea of evolution. If large bones are found, science can create a creature to explain any discovery, but never the discovery of giant bones, animals, or dragons. It always has to be something they came up with, as if they have the trademark on dinosaurs, so anything found is dinosaurs. Now, here's where you can start to look into and research mud fossils and the connection that comes with them. Now, mud fossils are key to proving all of these theories because their existence prove many of our claims and that they are lying. Geology is the study of fossilized biology, and the mud fossils can be covered in a future documentary. I might put a mud fossil kind of a quick thing at the end of this video. It's like a bonus, but it's such a vast topic of research that I'm not going to cover it right here, but it is very interesting how all of these things come together when you are truthful and you're not trying to, create this narrative that supports their claims. We're trying to find the truth. We do our own research, we come up with our own conclusions, and it makes a lot more sense than what they're pushing. So this is just like a quick once over on these mud fossils. This is like a camel that's in the side of a mountain, fossilized in, and whatever kind of mud or surrounding invasive element or molecule there is will take on the properties of that. So if a creature is buried in mud, it will slowly suck the elements and minerals out of the mud and facilitate some type of a balance which causes this fossilization. Okay, now I've done lots of research on these mud fossils. I've done lots of videos and posts on my Instagram and all this stuff connecting to the mud fossils. I have found and discovered many of these mud fossils, which discount lots of the information pushed on us by the geologists and the mainstream academia and things like that. And, you look into a lot of these giant creatures frozen, buried in the mud. Then the seawater mixing in would have caused this fossilization and things like that. And evidence of these giants built into the surrounding um, topography of the land. The geology is of the mud, and then when you find solid rock, it usually connects to these fossilized beings, fossilized trees, fossilized things that were once living and then died. And then you see the evidence all throughout our realm of these giant people who were melted by lightning bolts from heavens, melted with a kind of technology of directed energy weapons. We don't know, but it's a very interesting piece of the puzzle that we have to acknowledge. Now, the talking about dragons. There's a lot of evidence that suggests a lot of these old world cities were burned and melted to the ground. And we just assume that because dragons aren't real, it had to be some kind of solar flare event. It had to be some kind of atmospheric discharge of lightning or some type of directed energy weapons of the old world and things like that. But when you understand there's lots of evidence of these dragons, we don't know the scale of the dragons. Were these dragons hundreds of thousands of feet tall? Was the wingspan miles wide? Were these people fighting these dragons? How tall were they? Were they 100-foot tall people or were they 17-foot tall people? We don't really know. In the Bible, it says that the archangel Michael came down and slew the dragon and cut the head off of the dragon. If you're familiar with Roger Spur and the discovery of the giant dragon across Africa and the big fish and all that stuff, these continent sized creatures kind of disprove all these other things, and it's very interesting. So if you're doing this research for 10, 15 years, you start to find more and more evidence. And here's this picture of this giant dragon, horrible lizard, dinosaur, reptilian thing smashed into the landscape, smashed into, possibly within a tree, old world trees, mountains, something like that, fossilized and kind of hidden in plain sight where no one would even assume. They would just think, look at that rock, looks kind of like a giant creature. But there is so much evidence that supports the claims of giant creatures, giant dragons, giant humans, all this kind of stuff, and very interesting. Now, the dragons may also explain the melted buildings. There's lots of evidence of melted buildings, melted superstructure buildings, and were these dragons the ones responsible? Now, everybody knows, you know, no one was talking about dragons, and then people start to kind of look into it and question things, and then they come out with Game of Thrones and show you these dragons, where now it's in the fantasy fiction realm and it's not real because, well, you're just thinking that that's real because you saw Game of Thrones or something. And it's kind of ridiculous that the more we find, then they come out with a movie about it. The same with the giant people. I don't know if anybody has seen the like Troll Hunter movie on Netflix, and there was some other troll kind of movies where the giant fossilized, humanoid trolls, slowly become alive and then they turn to stone and then break them into pieces and stuff. It's just like they have to tell you the truth in some forum or another. And that is one of the biggest things they're lying because they always have to tell you the truth in some way. And if science is false and fiction is false, two negatives are a double negative, and that turns into a positive. So science fiction is a way of telling you the truth through the medium of TV and movies and science fiction books and stuff like that. But lots of evidence of these melted buildings. Was this caused by technology? Was this caused by dragons? Was this caused by, some kind of God interfering and making this possible? We don't know, but there is evidence, lots of evidence of these giant melted buildings, and lots of evidence of melted red bricks along with this. That's kind of another rabbit hole you could go down, is the melted bricks aspect of all this and how much heat it would take to melt bricks. And we see that here in this stonework. So very interesting. This is the Hathor temple in Egypt, and you can see the staircase has just been melted to liquid. Now, did some kind of a dragon breathe through this hallway and melt all these stairs? Was it some kind of high electrical power that caused this? And I also think that it's possible that some type of acid rain or something rained on these structures and liquefied them, turned them to sand. I also think that if you are making uh 3D printed super cities out of red bricks and the sewer systems and all that stuff, if let's say you wanted to tear it down and build something in its footprint, the kind of work it would take to disassemble and destroy all these old world brick buildings would have been a lot. When possibly they would have invented some kind of a liquid they could have sprayed on the city from up above, and that may have caused a chemical reaction which would have, maybe weakened the mortar, weakened the bricks, and then it would have been used to, bomb and blow them up. And then, they could have reused all the materials while 3D printing the city to remake anything they kind of needed. So I think a chemical reaction also kind of explains this, other than just a high heat reaction, if that kind of makes sense. So this information is everywhere when you start to look for it and when you do your own investigations. Now, here is the map of Japan, and we know the Japanese and the Asians, China, all throughout, um, the Asian realm, they are obsessed with dragons. Here's a depiction of Japan, after this dragon has its head cut off? Was this a biblical event? And then thousands of years go by and you build civilization on top of the corpse of some dragon. Very interesting. I find a lot of these maps showing the depictions of giants and things like that. So it's just like there's so many pieces hiding right out in plain sight. A lot of people don't want to accept it, but it just kind of sticks out as the missing piece to the puzzle you are trying to put back together. And the truth is stranger than fiction, especially when you figure out that our history is a fiction. It's a story. It's just a story written by someone, which is most likely his story is the story of Lucifer and his secret takeover of our realm. It's not our story, it's his story. And it is of the story of this Satan's release after this millennial reign and all this kind of stuff. It all kind of goes together. It's all a fabrication of the controllers. It's all a fabrication of something to trick us and to get us to accept their version of reality. Very interesting. So you must ask yourself what really happened? Why was this hidden? When did this happen? And who has done this? And those answers are out there for you to discover for yourself when we do this research.